Welcome to our teaching on the Jewish oral tradition. We'll focus especially on the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Midrash. You'll know what those mean after our teaching. And we're going to dive into a bit of vocabulary related to this topic. You can sound it out in the Hebrew. Torah. Okay. Rabbi. Good. Rav. Okay. Darash. Midrash. Okay, which is the name of the biblical commentaries, so that we're digging into scripture for deeper meanings. Okay. Lamad. Talmud. Okay. Shana. Okay, and he repeated, and Shana is also the name for year because it's like the repeating of time. And Mishnah, repetition or study. And there were people walking around in Jesus's time who were like the repeaters, the Tanaim, the walking encyclopedias who would just memorize the commentaries and spit them out because they wouldn't write them down. They would be memorized orally or repeated. And some of Jewish study is just to repeat what the masters have said. Next, Gamar and Gemara, okay, which is a layer of the Talmud, and you might have heard that in Jewish novels and stuff like that. People studying Gemara. Now, Midrash. This is my friend Yehuda, who's a very serious rabbi and teacher and educator of educators, one of the most important institutes in Jerusalem, and who really took an interest in us as Catholics. And it's not always reciprocal, but really I met Yehuda and he wanted to befriend a Christian on the streets of Rome. And it was the first time he'd traveled outside of Israel or Paris, where he has relatives, just traveling by himself. First time he had just traveled for curiosity. And as his kids were out of the house and having their his grandkids, he wanted to say, well, I grew up in Paris where I had Christian friends and just hear so much about Christians today, but I'm not in touch with that reality because things are so divided in Israel. He said, I just want to go and see. And so he's a very Orthodox rabbi who wanted me to show him churches and stuff like that. And we've stayed in touch till this day. Last time I was in Israel, we went and had coffee, and I was able to arrange for him to meet the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and he was able to be present when Pope Francis visited as well. And but someone who is so happy to talk about Jewish learning, and he's patient with the fact that he knows how ignorant we are. Here he is opening a scroll of the Torah to show us a synagogue. And so synagogues and study houses, places where Jews would gather. And so in Jesus' time, probably the synagogue served as a study house, and then Talmud in some ways goes one way, and the integrity of the scriptures remain in the synagogue proclaimed. And there's certain parts more related to the law that will be concentrated on in the study house. So let's just start with the Midrash, since it's closer to our reality. Midrash is just commentaries on scripture. And a lot of times they're fun and they're trying to fill the holes a lot of times. So I don't know if you ever picked up scripture. A lot of times you can pick up the New Testament and especially in the Old and just say, well, wait, what's the missing link between this passage and this passage? And so a lot of the commentaries are just trying to fill in the holes. So if you could quickly read this passage, and there's two events that are happening here in Genesis 22 and 23. So God put Abraham to the test and asked him to take Isaac, your only one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. You can just skim the rest up through chapter 23. Okay, you know the story well. In verse 19, Abraham then returned to his servants, and they set out together for Beersheba, where Abraham lived. Chapter 23. The span of Sarah's life was 127 years. She died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham proceeded to mourn and weep for her. What's the whole? I mean, why did Sarah die?
Yeah.
Right? All of a sudden she died. It doesn't really give any lead up to that, right? Except the fact that the thing that happened before that is exactly. And so Midrash Bereshit Rabbah down at the bottom of the page there, which is a long tractate with lots of different stories. This is just a couple of lines out of it. Abraham came to lament for Sarah and to weep for her. From where did he come? Rabbi Levi said, he came from Terah's burial to that of Sarah. Rabbi Yosef said to him, but is it not so that Terah's burial preceded Sarah's burial by 2 years? Rather, from where did he come? From Mount Moriah. Sarah died as a result of grief over that incident. That is why the binding of Isaac is juxtaposed to Sarah's lifetime was. That's funny, right? What a shock. And so there's different stories that have come, like, made that more explicit, and even little dialogues between the devil and Sarah making her doubt, and or the fact that Abraham, what time did Abraham leave to take Isaac to sacrifice him? Early the next morning, verse 3, Genesis 22, verse 3. Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him to his servants and his son Isaac. Okay, so how do you put that together? Why did he go early in the morning? So Sarah would know, right? No. So it's kind of cute, right? As that's an example of Midrash, and there's so many different Midrashim that might open up to us what the Old Testament texts are. And who's seen the book, the movie Noah that came out with Russell Crowe, came out 10, 15 years ago. So it's got a lot of details there that people started saying, hey, this wasn't in the Bible. Why did you put this in the movie? And then they studied and they realized it was coming from the Jewish Midrashim. And
So is this a separate writing that
yeah.
they read along with?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's several different Midrashim.
Written as they're reading.
Yeah. And so the Midrash on Genesis is probably a collection of lots of different commentaries on Genesis that were eventually put together and made into one book. And yeah. It's not. It's separate. It's totally apart. It was in the same context in the beginning, and then the two kind of are distinguished as two different genres. So the Talmud is specifically focusing on what do we have to do to keep the law. And so there's a lot of other stories in the Bible that aren't directly related to a law that you have to follow. Okay, there's how many commandments in the law? 613, is there's lots of debates about, well, how do we, it's not all that clear. What are the details? How do we know, how big our hut needs to be for sukkah? Or how do we know? We'll see the first question of the Mishnah, which is what time do we have to pray the Shema? Okay, we'll get there. So here's a picture of the Talmud, and you can see the funny way it's written or calligraphied. If you look at that picture where it says Talmud, on the left side of the page, how many different sections do you see?
3. 4. 1.
It was actually 4 because that one at the bottom, right? You can't see very well. Okay, and those are, what do you think the oldest section is? Good. The one in the middle, and the others grow around it. And people talk about it being like a tree. If you cut a tree, slice a tree horizontal, you see the oldest part of the tree in the middle, right? And the other parts grow around it. Okay, so that's the way they're traditionally written. And here you can see in the
How do they read it? From,
right to left.
okay,
Yeah, it's
so the
it's
center,
Hebrew
like
writing.
the centerpiece and then,
Well, so you're gonna have the centerpiece. You might have a couple lines of the centerpiece that are related to one of the other or part of the other paragraphs. So the other paragraphs that are added in are from different time periods, and we'll see that in the diagram below. But yeah, the center of it is the oldest, and the other sides, and so if you pick up a Talmud today, it'll have other layers that are modern commentaries about this that are farther into the margins. And so there's two different Talmuds with the same Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah, this oldest part, and at the fall of the temple, there's a minority of Jews and Jewish life that revolves around the Holy Land. The Sanhedrin is reconstituted in Galilee, and there's a study house that's founded in near where Tel Aviv is today. And um, so the learning goes on in the Promised Land, the Holy Land, but the biggest center of learning develops where? In Babylon. Okay, there's a really strong Jewish community there. Uh, that was still there from the time of Jesus, right? That's where kind of synagogue worship and rabbinical Judaism has its origins before Jesus in that Babylonian Jews, the Babylonian exile. But when they didn't all come back to the Promised Land, a lot of them stayed. So there's been there was a continuous community of strong Judaism from that 6th century BC until the 1980s. Okay. And so the Bavli, the Babylon Talmud, continues to develop and is really codified, written down 5th century, and it's a lot more extensive. The Yerushalmi is a lot shorter because their means and numbers were a lot smaller.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Going back to before, to Jesus' time, to his life, but he didn't do the studying and the commentary. I mean, he was a carpenter. How much was he involved in?
So most people who are studying are also have some kind of physical job to pay the bills.
Yes.
Okay, so Jesus is part of when you hear about the scribes and the Pharisees, when you see Jesus sit down in the synagogue, he probably was going to both pray and study regularly at his synagogue, and he's part of this ambiance of students, and so people are fishermen or they're carpenter, but they're very literate.
Yeah.
Because they're also spending time praying texts and studying and being questioned on different passages, and how there's a Jewish method of study that really was there in Jesus's time that would debate about the meaning of Scripture. So this is part of Jesus' ambiance.
Involved in this a lot in the week. I mean, would they do this in the evening? I'm just thinking about their lives,
Of
but
course, yeah.
and okay.
How they were definitely limited according to what their other career is.
Yeah.
Some of them are able to dedicate themselves more and therefore more important and learned. If you're richer, you could invest more time into study as well.
Kind of wondered if he just knew this because of his divine nature, or did he, when he was in the temple at 12 years of age, did he already have a lot of?
Well, he certainly grew up with the ambiance, yeah, of study and memorizing text, and so he's not quoting it from his divine memory. I mean, of course, it's guided by his divinity, but it's his human Jewish upbringing that brings him to a great knowledge of. Of course, they had an order of prayers and psalms that they're praying, and so they're supposed to pray 3 times a day and harmonize their prayers on the prayers of the temple. So the prayers are happening in a more official way in the temple, but in Babylon, they're so far from the temple, so they start praying 3 times a day in a pretty intense way and praying the same prayers that they were being prayed. It would have been prayed in the temple, and when they restore the temple, they know what to do. They've kept that up. So Jesus is part of that Babylonian Judaism.
So rabbinic Judaism started in Babylon.
You could say it started in Babylon at certain functions.
Predominate after the temple Judaism was obliterated by the Romans.
Yeah, and in Jesus' time it was already predominant. That was Jesus' Judaism was a synagogue Judaism that would go to Jerusalem for the feasts, but certainly had life of its own that had developed in Babylon. Galilee was populated by Babylonian Jews during the time of the Maccabees,
You said it continued until the 80s?
1980s. It was anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. Yeah, sure. Oh, Iraq. Yeah. And so you can take a look at these layers. So you can see the Mishnah in the middle. The Gemara is also in the middle underneath the Mishnah, the next layer. And then the comments of Rashi, we'll get to that really quick, in the blue on the right. So that's already in the 11th century. Tosafists, 12th and 13th centuries, Tunisia, 11th century. So interesting, these different layers and different tractates and parts of it will include or exclude some of these, right? And different cross references at the bottom and text information. So you can see the different layers that are built around the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is really first century before Christ, and during Christ's time, the certain number of very important rabbis that their sayings were the most important, and so they would be repeated the most, and so they're getting passed down to us. So if you read a Seder Haggadah, the Seder order, the reading that the Jews use for their Seder, it's a lot of these same rabbis who were of that time as the Mishnah was hatching right at Jesus' time. So it's a big question. How much did these rabbis know about the prophecies and stuff like that? And then Jesus himself, how aware was he? Perhaps he was hearing those commentaries himself. Okay, but then there's like between the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, there's this kind of time where those conversations have been memorized and repeated, but there's the fall of the temple, so there's really a break in the study. They're not able to concentrate as much, and so that's the time when Christianity is spreading as well, and so that's where this big fracture is. So we don't find a whole lot of crossover between the New Testament and the Mishnah, surprisingly. We might expect to find some because they're two parallel movements, but in fact, they're both movements that are kind of on the run in different directions.
So the Mishnah's part? Yeah, I guess I don't.
The Talmud is like the whole book here.
Oh. We'll just.
Right, exactly. Okay, so if you go down to page 5, the layers that we just talked about, the Mishnah, the Gemara, then Rashi, and etc. Now, Rashi is an interesting layer because he considered the Mishnah and the Gemara and the sacred scriptures written in Hebrew so holy that he didn't want to use the same script. So he invented his own language. Or perhaps it was just a stylistic language they're using at the time. At any rate, his commentaries, he's considered the most basic commentator of the Mishnah, and really giving simple meanings, but very standard meanings. And it's written with this alphabet that's similar to the Hebrew alphabet. So you can kind of compare it. Does the aleph look like an aleph? Does the bet that looks like a backwards 3? Sorry, just looks like a 3. Does that look like a bet? Kind of the gimel. So you can try to go through the alphabet and see if you can see how they correspond. The top at the end of each of those alphabets looks really similar, right? Okay, so that's an interesting feature of the Talmud, is this different alphabet that's in there. It was just Rashi writing his script. Really, there isn't another. It wasn't like it was a dialect somewhere or a style of somewhere. He just kind of invented it for this reason, it seems like. Okay, and then there's 6 orders. Okay, so 6 parts of the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Talmud. They cover these different subjects. Some people say the 6 jars at the wedding feast at Cana could refer to these 6 orders. And you can read through that if you'd like. See the different practical questions that are covered in these texts. And let's get into the text themselves a little bit. The beginning of the Mishnah, the first words of the Mishnah, from what time does one recite Shema in the morning? What's the earliest you can say the Shema, which is like the most basic prayer that Jews need to say every morning and every evening? The Hero Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. It immediately defines the start time as when one can distinguish between sky blue and white, initiating the laws of daily prayers and reciting the Shema. Okay, it's a very practical question. Like, tell me when can I pray this to get it out of the way and get to work, right? Or do I have to do it on the fishing boat because I've been out there since before dawn, right? They all have this memorized anyway.
It's sky blue and white.
Right.
But, yeah, I mean, white would be clouds, wouldn't it? You know, or
Sky blue and white. I don't know. Maybe we need
You're
a
outside as the sun
ancient
comes.
definition.
First, it's just white above the horizon, and the sky stays black, and then at some point, just before the sun comes up, the sky turns blue.
Well, good question. Let's look into it. Okay, on responsibility. You are not obliged to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So I have to finish the work. What does it mean I have to finish my work? On judgment, do not judge your fellow until you reach his place. Don't judge him without seeing him. So
walk a mile in his walk.
there's a lot of wisdom. You can see there's a lot of wisdom that sometimes even we could border on psychology and stuff. On humanity, no two minds are alike, just as no two faces are alike. Amazing, huh? If a person says, I have worked hard but have not found success, don't believe him. If he says, I have not exerted myself and I have found success, don't believe him. If he says, I gave him my all and I have found success, believe him. Do not say something that should never be heard, because ultimately it will be heard. Look not at the picture, but upon what is inside. For the sake of peace, one may lie, but peace itself should never be a lie. He who teaches a child is as if he had created it. Wow. So these are all really interesting kind of proverbs that are found within there, that are dropped here and there. Obviously, most of the Talmud, you can imagine, is pretty boring. I snuck into an Orthodox study house with a kippah one day, and the guy's like, okay, welcome. Who do you want to study with? Let's sit you down with this guy. And he talked to me for an hour about how deep a mikveh should be, a basin for a ritual bath. And just kept telling me all these different opinions and what he thought about it and how it put we spent weeks studying the same passage when I was in a Talmud class for us as Catholic seminarians, trying to show a good example of a Talmud citation. And it was about something called ona devarim, which means dishonesty about things, which means that when you're in the market, it was all this stuff about how you shouldn't, if somebody asks, you shouldn't go to a store and ask the price of something unless you have an intention to buy. Okay, because you'll oblige them to say something, and then you can go to the next store, right? And you're gonna bargain the price, and you shouldn't do that. And then like some clauses that applies to when you're talking with your fellow Jewish brothers. But if it's somebody who came and he moved in, set up his shop, sure, you can ask him. It's just like we're a community. We need to kind of stand together and not cheat each other. And so, but it was really subtle business ethics questions that were in there. And so there's all kinds of questions on all these different subjects. And it's the Jewish approach of saying, I need to follow the law. I need to please the Lord. What are the details? Help me understand the details. And then within that, there's meaning that comes out and wisdom that comes out in so many areas. Okay, Christian, to finish up, Christian burnings of the Talmud. 1242, the Paris burning. A former Jew accused the Talmud of containing blasphemies against Jesus and Mary. So let's burn the Talmud because another religion speaks badly of ours. Pope Gregory the IX ordered the confiscation of all Talmuds. Wow. King Saint Louis put the books on trial where rabbis had to defend them. Finally, in 1242, 24 wagon loads of hand-copied Can you imagine how many manuscripts and how much time and how many centuries were burned, representing a massive loss of rare documents? Rome 1553, the Inquisition, Venice 1553, and we could also cite in the War of Independence, or obviously in the Holocaust, or all the destruction that happened with total disregard to that heritage, right? All right.
Talmud still goes on.
That's what I have.
despite all of this, right?
The Talmud still goes on, and that's the beauty of Jewish learning is it's not just on a text, it's in their minds, and you can imagine Jews trying to carry this on during the Shoah because they have so much memorized, and they're able to keep a lot of their religion up, even though it might have seemed futile for them. But each time they've had disasters or had to move from one place to another, the more they had memorized, the easier it was to take that with them. And the more their learning was a method and not just a text. They really have this way of questioning each other, studying in twos, sitting in a study house, and you're studying with a pair, and the rabbi's coming around and giving you tips and listening to what you're talking about. It's very different from our classroom learning, lecture learning. And it's also the idea of, well, we're going to go to a study house where we're also living together, trying to live out the laws as we're there, and so it's certainly a world too that is different, many different things we could say, but another is that it's the man's world. So when I was studying in my Talmud class, we had to do a project, and I had to narrow down my subject, so I did the woman in the Talmud. So there was one Jewish sage named Baruria that was the exception that proved the rule, right? There's a lot that concerns women here, but women's responsibility is the home and rearing children and the family and certain commandments that relate to that. Whereas the man is really respected not just if he works, but if he studies the law, dedicates himself to glorifying the Lord by studying the law, by praying 3 times a day and studying the law. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to end the recording.